This is the story of a man who chose death over compromise, guided by an inner voice that spoke to him since childhood. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, executed in 399 BCE, represents something psychologically fascinating. A person so committed to following their internal compass that they willingly walk toward their own destruction. Psychological research suggests this wasn't madness, but a specific cognitive orientation that still exists today. What makes Socrates psychologically interesting isn't just that he died for his beliefs, but that his behaviour mirrors something we see in nature. Emperor penguins march up to 120 kilometres inland, away from food and safety, into one of Earth's harshest environments where temperatures drop to -40 or -60 degrees Celsius. Both the penguin and Socrates followed an inner direction that seemed completely irrational to outside observers, yet both represent evolutionary and philosophical success stories. We're going to explore the psychology of inner-directed individuals through Socrates' life, examining what neuroscience and modern research tell us about people who follow their own compass, regardless of social pressure, what this costs them, and what it gives them in return. The psychology behind the inner voice. Socrates described something he called his daimonion, a Greek term meaning divine something that had spoken to him since childhood. What makes this psychologically fascinating is its specific nature. The voice only prevented him from taking certain actions and never commanded him to do something. As he explained, "I have a divine or spiritual sign which began when I was a child. It is a voice, and whenever it speaks, it turns me away from something I am about to do, but it never encourages me to do anything." In modern psychological terms, we might interpret this as highly developed intuition or an internalized ethical reasoning system, so refined that it operated almost automatically. Socrates trusted this internal guidance system more than social consensus, more than legal authority, or more than the approval of the powerful. In 1950, sociologist David Reisman identified this personality type in his book, The Lonely Crowd, distinguishing between inner-directed individuals guided by internalized principles and other directed individuals guided by peer groups and external validation. Socrates was the prototype of the inner-directed person, and modern psychology has extensively studied people who operate this way. The 5 core traits of inner-directed people research has identified specific psychological characteristics that define people who follow their internal compass, and Socrates demonstrated all of them. The first trait is what psychologist Julian Rotter identified in 1966 as internal locus of control. People with internal locus of control believe they control their own destiny and respond less to external rewards or punishments. Socrates refused payment for his teaching when other philosophers charged high fees, deliberately provoked powerful Athenians despite knowing the risks, and maintained his philosophical practice even when it made him enemies. The pattern stayed consistent throughout his life. Second comes self-concordance, which psychologists Ken Sheldon and Andrew Elliott studied in 1999, examining the alignment between a person's goals and their authentic values. Their study found that people pursuing internally motivated goals report higher happiness and well-being even when facing obstacles. Socrates pursued philosophy not for money, not for status, not for safety, but because it aligned with what he believed was the right way to live, and he never deviated from that path. The third characteristic is moral autonomy. Psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg identified in 1981 the highest stage of moral reasoning as universal ethical principles, making ethical decisions based on principles rather than consequences. When Socrates served on Athens' Council of 500 in 406 BCE, he stood alone against the illegal trial of generals after a naval battle, risking his life to uphold legal procedure despite mob pressure demanding their execution. One person against the entire system. Fourth is tolerance for social disapproval. Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments in 1951 found that only 25% of subjects never conformed to group pressure. Socrates lived firmly in that 25%, maintaining his positions regardless of social consequences, and the cost would eventually be his life. The fifth trait is intrinsic motivation. Edward Deci and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory, developed in 1985, distinguishes between intrinsic motivation, driven by internal satisfaction, and extrinsic motivation, driven by external rewards. Socrates embodied pure intrinsic motivation, spending his time philosophizing rather than earning money, while his family struggled financially. Yet he never questioned this choice. What happens in the brain neuroscience has begun identifying the brain regions associated with self-directed behavior, and understanding these areas helps explain why inner-directed people operate so differently from others. The medial prefrontal cortex handles self-reflection and personal values, essentially acting as the neurological foundation for asking, who am I and what matters to me? The anterior cingulate cortex monitors conflict when personal values clash with social norms, creating that uncomfortable feeling when you know what you should do contradicts what everyone expects. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex manages value-based decision-making, weighing options according to your internal hierarchy of what matters. What's fascinating is that in inner-directed individuals, these systems appear to operate with unusual strength and consistency. When faced with a choice between social approval and internal values, their brains weight the internal values more heavily than most people's brains do. This isn't a conscious decision, but a fundamental difference in how their neural systems process social versus personal information. Research by neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues in 2003 found that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Inner-directed people experience this pain just like everyone else, but their value processing systems override it. They feel the pain of rejection and choose their principles anyway. The penguin's journey and the philosopher's choice. Emperor penguins engage in behavior that seems absolutely irrational from an outside perspective. Males fast for up to 120 days while incubating a single egg, losing up to 45% of their body weight, enduring winds up to 200 kilometers per hour in temperatures that would kill most creatures. Why would any animal do this? Because they're following an evolutionary program, an internal direction that has proven successful over millions of years. The penguin doesn't question whether this is rational or take a vote among other penguins about whether this is a good idea. Socrates demonstrated parallel behavior throughout his life. When he could have escaped execution through exile, he chose to stay. When he could have stopped philosophizing to save his life, he continued. When he could have compromised slightly during his trial, he suggested instead that Athens should honor and feed him like an Olympic victor. His behavior looked irrational to observers who valued survival above all else. The penguin marches inland while Socrates remained in Athens. The penguin endures extreme cold for reproduction, while Socrates endured poverty for philosophy. Both followed an inner direction that seemed like it should lead to destruction, but instead led to a form of success that external observers couldn't initially comprehend. The emperor penguin population stands at approximately 595,000 adults today, after millions of years of following this seemingly destructive instinct. Socrates lived only 71 years, but his philosophical approach has survived over 2,400 years and influenced billions of people. The high cost of following your own path. Let's be clear about what inner direction cost Socrates, because understanding these costs is necessary for anyone considering this psychological orientation. Social isolation came first. Research by psychologist Stanley Schachter in 1951 found that deviants in groups face systematic rejection, and Socrates experienced this at the societal level. Athens described him as a gadfly, an insect that irritates the state, and the powerful men he questioned turned into enemies who would eventually kill him. Material poverty followed. While other philosophers charged high fees for teaching, Socrates refused payment and spent his time philosophizing rather than earning money. His family struggled as a result, and though ancient sources portray his wife Xanthippe as frustrated, we should be cautious about accepting these biased accounts. What's clear is that his choice to follow his principles directly harmed his family's financial security. The family strain extended beyond money. Socrates had 3 sons, one possibly still an infant when he died, and he chose principles over family security. When his wealthy friend Crito arranged an escape plan that would have let him live out his remaining years in exile, Socrates refused. He left his wife a widow and his children fatherless when he could have chosen survival. Death came at 71 years old, Approximately 280 jurors voted him guilty, only 30 votes away from acquittal, but then 360 voted for his execution after he refused to show proper remorse. 80 more jurors voted for his death than had voted him guilty, swayed by his defiant suggestion that Athens should honour him rather than punish him. Modern research on whistleblowers shows similar patterns. People who follow their conscience against institutional pressure face severe career damage, social ostracism, and psychological stress. Studies indicate the vast majority of whistleblowers report these costs, and research by Kipling-Williams on ostracism has found that social rejection causes psychological pain comparable to physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes physical pain, also activates during social exclusion. Socrates wasn't immune to this pain. He simply valued his principles more than avoiding it. The psychological benefits that made it worth it. The costs were severe, but modern psychology has documented benefits that help explain why inner-directed people accept these costs. Self-respect and integrity came first. During his trial, Socrates stated, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And this wasn't abstract philosophy, but his core argument for why he couldn't stop his philosophical practice, even to save his life. Research by psychologist Alex Wood and colleagues in 2008. I've published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, studied 205 participants, and found that authenticity, living in accordance with one's true self, strongly correlated with well-being and life satisfaction. Peace of mind followed. Despite facing execution, accounts describe Socrates' serenity in his final hours with no regrets about his choices. This aligns with Viktor Frankl's observations in Man's Search for Meaning, written in 1946 after surviving Nazi concentration camps, where he found that having a sense of purpose sustains people through extreme suffering. A 2014 study by Patrick Hill and Nicholas Turiano confirmed that having purpose in life is associated with reduced mortality, meaning people with a strong sense of purpose literally live longer. Moral clarity provided a third benefit. When you're following external validation, you're constantly adjusting to others' opinions. But when you're following internal principles, you have a stable reference point. Research on self-concordant goals by Sheldon and Hauser Marco in 2001 found that people pursuing internally motivated goals experience greater well-being even when facing obstacles because they don't experience the cognitive dissonance and internal conflict that comes from acting against one's values. Meaning was perhaps the most powerful benefit. Socrates' life had profound meaning because he lived according to his deepest values, and that choice gave his life ultimate coherence. When faced with drinking hemlock or compromising his principles, he chose the poison and remained calm while discussing philosophy with his friends. His last words were a reminder to pay a debt owed to the god of healing and maintaining his integrity to the final moment. How inner direction works in modern life. We live in a world radically different from ancient Athens, yet the psychology of inner versus outer direction remains constant, and understanding this helps us navigate contemporary pressures. The modern environment creates unprecedented pressure toward other direction. Social media provides constant feedback metrics where likes, shares, followers, and comments let us measure our social approval in real time. Algorithms curate content designed to maximize engagement, creating echo chambers that reward conformity to group opinions. Comparison culture surrounds us as we constantly measure ourselves against curated versions of others' lives. Maintaining inner direction in this environment requires conscious effort and specific psychological skills. You need to regularly examine your life as Socrates advocated, distinguishing between what you genuinely value and what you're pursuing for external validation. You need tolerance for social disapproval when your values diverge from your peer group. You need the ability to feel the pain of rejection and choose your principles anyway. Research consistently shows that authenticity, self-concordance, and intrinsic motivation predict greater well-being and life satisfaction. People who follow their own values report more meaning in their lives than people who chase external markers of success, and these benefits persist even when the costs are high. The balance between inner and outer direction. Inner direction isn't always right, and understanding its limitations matters as much as understanding its benefits. As Socrates had blind spots that his inner direction didn't correct. He engaged primarily with male citizens in a patriarchal society and never challenged gender hierarchies. He questioned craftsmen's wisdom while benefiting from their work. His philosophical method was accessible mainly to the leisured class. His approach could be unnecessarily provocative, turning potential allies into enemies. Some critics argue he was stubborn rather than wise. Minor compromise could have saved his life and let him continue teaching for years. His choice left his wife and young children without support. His intellectual approach, some argue, was actually a form of arrogance masked as humility, and he failed to produce positive political change in Athens despite decades of effort. These criticisms have merit because inner direction isn't automatically superior to other direction. Sometimes following the group is wise, sometimes compromise is the ethical choice, and sometimes listening to external feedback improves our thinking. The question isn't whether to be purely inner-directed or purely other-directed, but finding the right balance for living a meaningful life aligned with your values. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister and colleagues has found that people need both autonomy and belonging, both internal direction and social connection. The healthiest psychological state involves being able to access both modes, knowing when to stand firm on principles and when to adapt to social context. Recognizing your own inner direction. Understanding whether you tend toward inner or outer direction helps you make better decisions about your life path. Inner-directed people often report feeling different from others from a young age. They describe a strong sense of "this is wrong" or "this isn't me" when pressured to conform, even when they can't articulate why. They experience relief when finally able to act according to their values, even when that action brings negative consequences. They feel more anxiety from violating their own principles than from disappointing others. Outer-directed people often describe comfort in belonging and distress at standing out. They naturally attune to social cues and adjust their behaviour to maintain harmony. They experience relief when receiving approval and anxiety when facing rejection. They feel more anxiety from disappointing others than from compromising their own preferences. Neither orientation is better or worse, but understanding yours helps you predict what situations will drain you versus energize you. Inner-directed people often struggle in highly political environments but thrive when given autonomy. Outer-directed people often excel at building consensus but struggle when forced to take unpopular stands. The key is recognizing your natural tendency and working with it rather than fighting it. If you're inner-directed, you'll pay costs for following your compass, but trying to become other-directed will make you miserable. If you're other-directed, you'll find happiness in connection and belonging, but trying to become a lone crusader will drain you. When inner direction becomes necessary. Certain situations demand inner direction regardless of your natural tendency, and recognizing these situations helps you prepare for them psychologically. Moral emergencies are the clearest example. When you witness injustice or harm and have the power to intervene, your internal ethical system must override social pressure to stay silent. Research on bystander intervention shows that people who act in emergencies often report experiencing an overwhelming internal imperative that overrode their fear of social consequences. Career transitions often require temporary inner direction. When changing fields or starting something new, external validation disappears because you're no longer expert in your domain. So you must rely on internal conviction that you're on the right path while others question your choices. Research on career satisfaction shows that people who make values-based career changes report initial anxiety, but long-term fulfillment. Creative work demands inner direction because you're creating something that doesn't exist yet and can't be validated by existing standards. Writers, artists, inventors, and entrepreneurs must follow an internal vision through periods of external skepticism. Studies of creative individuals consistently find high tolerance for ambiguity and ability to persist without external validation. Life transitions like becoming a parent, caring for aging relatives, or facing serious illness often strip away external validation and force you to rely on internal values. And research on post-traumatic growth shows that people who emerge stronger from crises often report developing clearer internal values and less concern for social approval. The penguin, the philosopher, and emperor penguins have survived for millions of years by following their instinctive program, marching inland into the storm, because that's what successful reproduction requires in their environment. Socrates lived 71 years, but his philosophical program has survived over 2,400 years, influencing billions of people by following his internal compass toward truth, even when it led to his execution. Both represent a fundamental psychological truth. Sometimes following your inner direction, even when it seems to lead toward destruction, serves a deeper form of success that external observers can't immediately comprehend. And the cost of inner direction can be severe, as modern research on nonconformity confirms. Social rejection, material poverty, family strain, and in extreme cases like Socrates, death itself. People who deviate from group norms face systematic costs in terms of social acceptance, career opportunities, and psychological stress. The benefits are equally real and equally documented. Self-respect, peace of mind, moral clarity, meaning, and a life aligned with your deepest values rather than shaped by external pressures. Research shows these benefits predict well-being, life satisfaction, and even longevity. You don't have to drink hemlock to follow Socrates' example, and you don't have to march 120 kilometers into Antarctic winter like an emperor penguin. What you do have to decide is whether you'll follow your inner direction or let external validation determine your path. That decision is the difference between living your own life and performing someone else's script, between being authentically yourself and being a composite of others' expectations, between the examined life and the unexamined one. Socrates chose his path and died proving he believed in it. The penguin follows its instinct because evolution has proven it works. The question for each of us is what inner direction we're following, and whether we're willing to follow it when the environment turns hostile. That's when inner direction truly matters. Not when it's easy and everyone approves, but when it's hard and everyone opposes. That's when you discover whether you're following your own compass or just going along with the crowd. The psychology of people who follow an inner direction is costly and difficult and sometimes lonely. Research confirms these costs are real and substantial. But for those who possess this orientation, like Socrates standing alone against 501 jurors, like the penguin marching inland into the storm, it's the only way to live a life worth living. When Socrates drank the poison in 399 BCE, his last words were a reminder to pay a debt, maintaining his integrity to the final moment. Everything he owned added up to maintaining his principles over his survival. And 2,400 years later, we're still talking about the psychological framework he embodied. And that's the legacy of inner direction. It costs everything in the moment, but creates something that outlasts the individual life. The examined life isn't comfortable or safe or socially rewarded. But as Socrates proved with his death, and the penguins prove with every march inland, some forms of success require following an internal compass that external observers will never understand until long after the journey is complete.